Well, thank you. It's lovely to be here, yeah, it's been a great conference. Well, thanks to Susan Neiman for the invitation initially, and of course it's always a delight to be with Susan Robeson and to rekindle our friendship, so it's all been very, very special. I wasn't sure how much people would know. I'm not going to talk about the specifics necessarily of Robeson's connections with Wales, but let me initially at least just run through the connections he had with Wales, just to give a sense of its extent, really. It's said to have begun in 1928 when he, according to the story, impulsively joined a group of marching Welsh miners singing in London's West End. And the next 10 years then saw him donating money to and visiting Talagarn Miners' Rest Home, appearing in many concerts across Wales, including an appearance at the Caernarfon Pavilion the night after an explosion had claimed 266 lives at the Gresford Pit near Wrexham in North Wales. And then most famously in the 30s perhaps is a memorial meeting to the men of the International Brigade from Wales who gave their lives in defence of democracy in Spain, as the programme said. That was in Mountain Ash in 1938. The 30s also saw Robeson establishing connections with the multi-ethnic community in Cardiff's Docklands, known as Butetown or Tiger Bay, which was home to the political activist and Pan-Africanist native of Philadelphia and uncle by marriage to Robeson, Aaron Mazel. 1939 saw Robeson playing the role of David Goliath, an African-American who settles in a mining village, in one of the few movies which he didn't later disown, Proud Valley. As we know, hounded during the McCarthy era for his communist sympathies, Robeson had his passport confiscated from 1950 to 58. The persistent invitations made throughout the 50s for Robeson to appear at the Miners' Eisteddfod, and Eisteddfod is a cultural gathering and celebration, and there's an annual Miners' Eisteddfod in Porthcawl in South Wales every year. So there was an invite every year, come and sing, and he couldn't, and eventually, we heard yesterday, there was a transatlantic exchange which allowed the Eisteddfod audience to hear Robeson's voice via a telephonic link that had just been laid down from New York, and that's the cover of the recording of that event. Following the return of his passport in 58, he was introduced by Aneurin Bevan, I'll come back to that, and presented with a hymn book by the leading Welsh language modernist poet, T.H. Parry Williams, at the National Eisteddfod in Ebbw Vale. In October of that year, he finally appeared in person at the Miners' Eisteddfod, and his last significant contact with Wales occurred in 1960, when he appeared with the Cumbach Choir at a Movement for Colonial Freedom concert in the Royal Festival Hall in London. I've written quite a lot about all this, some crass self-promotion here, really, especially in this book, Black Skin, Blue Books, which traces a long tradition of Welsh engagement with African-American culture, but also actually the other way around. Wales was part of the circuit for abolitionists in the 19th century, and when Robeson came to sing in Wales, he was at least partly singing songs that the Welsh already knew. The spirituals were already part of the Welsh choral repertoire since the Fisc Jubilee singers had visited Wales first in the 1860s and kept visiting in the ensuing decades. So the songs weren't new. I mean, Robeson was part of a tradition, almost, we might say. A lot of the material is in the book. What I thought I'd do today, given that I've had this invitation, was to try and think and perhaps worry a little about the case for universalism that's in the conference's theme, and that's, of course, powerfully espoused in Susan's Left is Not Woke, a book that I'd already read and admired. The online blurb for the conference advertises it, and noting that, I quote, when Paul Robeson is remembered today, it's as a forerunner of the American civil rights movement. This he surely was, but his deep commitment to international solidarity is often forgotten in an age that is wary of anything which suggests ties to socialism. Now, I'm not inclined to disagree with that comment, and was moved that Susan Nyman, in her book, identifies Robeson's encounter with striking Welsh miners as marking his movement into political activism and as an embodiment of the universalism that her work powerfully espouses and that she sees embodied in the figure of Robeson. In Wales, however, it wouldn't be completely misleading to argue the opposite. That is, that Robeson, in the small nation on the westernmost peninsulas of Great Britain, is seen actually as an embodiment of international solidarity, while his commitment to the self-determination of minorities and role in informing the emergence of black nationalism is largely ignored. Since political devolution in 1999, where Wales for the first time had a measure of self-rule, the Labour Party has won every election to the Welsh Parliament. Indeed, since 1922, the Labour Party have won every significant election in Wales. And the party likes to present itself as internationalist in orientation, partly in order to define itself against what they perceive to be the nasty narrow-mindedness of Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party. The fact that the areas of Wales where Plaid Cymru gains its highest support voted strongly to remain in Europe in the Brexit referendum of 26, while the Labour voting areas voted strongly to leave, has not led to the rejection of this kind of narrative. And Paul Robeson plays a not insignificant part in the Welsh Labour movement's claims to embody the values of international solidarity. So it's kind of Welsh constructions of Robeson that I'm initially going to discuss. This narrative of Wales as the crucible for tolerant internationalism informed a school of social historians that emerged in the late 60s and early 70s, inspired by the first generation of the New Left, people like E.P. Thompson, Raymond Williams. They viewed the proletarian internationalism and cosmopolitanism of the South Wales valleys as being rooted in the plural experience of the coalfield. Wales was transformed in the 19th century from a rural nation across which most of its population of less than 500,000 people was pretty evenly distributed, to an industrial powerhouse by the end of the 19th century of almost 3 million people, 2/3 of that population packed into the coalfield of the southeast, and the demographics of Wales still reflect that to some extent. South Wales, noted the author Gwyn Thomas, was the part of America that never got on the boat. By the 1970s, that coalfield was in its last death throes. The Labour history of that period was an example of Hegel's Owl of Minerva taking flight at dusk, retrospectively. Its construction of a cosmopolitan internationalist South Wales remains very influential, and Paul Robeson plays a totemic role in that history. The historian Di Smith, who you see on the slide there, identifies the emblematic resonances of Robeson, while reinforcing the established view of cosmopolitan internationalist South Wales. South Wales, at its provocative best on the slide, contradicted the curtailers of human interaction anywhere and everywhere it could. The ideal was perhaps often merely, though movingly emblematic, as when South Wales miners arranged a transatlantic radio link so that Paul Robeson, deprived of his civil liberties and his passport in the USA, could sing to their Eisteddfod, or when Nye Bevan welcomed Robeson to the National Eisteddfod in Ebbw Vale in 1958. Yet if this South Wales was an ideal or even an abstract idea, it was also its actual representation, which was readily understood in human terms by those who came across it, and Robeson being one of those people. Aneurin Nye Bevan, as some of you might know, was the founder of the National Health Service, health minister in Clement Attlee's government of 1945. The Eisteddfod is an annual cultural festival with medieval roots, but resurrected as part of the invention of tradition witnessed across European nations in the 19th century. We needn't go after that, but what I want to emphasize is the resonance of Robeson and Bevan together on the Eisteddfod stage in 1958. A symbol of what could be done if Wales spoke to the world, says Di Smith. And historian Hywel Francis, who retained a connection with the Robeson family established by his father, the communist leader Di Francis, Hywel arranged, or at least partly arranged, Susan's visit to the National Eisteddfod in 2010, a memorable week. Hywel Francis referred to the event of Paul and Nye together as the meeting of two great internationalists and champions of humanity united at Wales's Prif its premier cultural festival. In the years following the granting of some measure of Welsh political autonomy, with the establishment of what was called in 1999 the National Assembly for Wales, a nice sort of colonial tick to that. It's now called the Welsh Parliament. Robeson emerged again as a significant cultural marker, a symbol of the internationalism that characterised the best of Wales's past and a signifier of a cultural tolerance which a devolved Wales was wanting to develop. The new millennium saw a striking exhibition sponsored by the new National Assembly, among others, entitled Let Robeson Sing, a celebration of the life of Paul Robeson and his relationship with Wales, travelling to universal acclaim across the nation. And the accompanying booklet sought to remind Wales, I quote, of an old friend who learned much from us and still has much to teach us as a people and as a nation. So the emphasis is on his universal humanity, right? That's the repeated idea. It's a myth of Wales. You know, there's plenty of racism and intolerance in Wales, but that's not the Wales we like to present. As in all claims to such universalist aspirations, it's always worth asking what's left out. The range of philosophical writings on this is vast, of course, whether we're dealing with Daniel Boyarin's work on the roots of anti-Semitism in the universalism of St. Paul's letters to the Galatians, where you'll recall there are no Greeks and no Jews, no slaves, no free, no male nor female, or René Girard's work on the scapegoat, or Slavoj Žižek on the exception, on which any claim to the one is based. The emphasis is on the frightening underside of universalism and universalist worldviews. What if I don't want to be part of the one? The answer historically is often that I'll be expatriated, locked up, or ethnically cleansed. In comparative terms, with the exception of the medieval conquest, perhaps, the levels of oppression have been relatively benign in Wales. But the scapegoat in the narrative of Welsh universalist internationalism has often been the Welsh language, that is, the cultural distinctiveness of Wales itself, which around 500,000 of us continue to speak. The author Gwyn Thomas, the South Wales America that never got on the boat, an author, a product of the mining valleys and its most powerful spokesman in English, captures the dominant structure of feeling and its emergence in the following passage. Gwyn was the youngest of 12 children. The first 6 he claimed spoke Welsh and the second 6 did not. I don't think language shift happens quite like that, but he's making a point. He charts the way in which a form of Christian universalism in the 19th century becomes a form of socialist universalism in the 20th, and in both cases, the desire was to eradicate the barriers to unity, to the unity of man. And Gwyn welcomed this. You know, he espoused eradication in a sense. In my childhood, a belief in the unity and brotherhood of man was as urgent and compelling a force as the gambling mania of today. When we sang, "He comes to break oppression and set the captive free, to take away transgression and rule in equity," we meant just that. The blend of evangelism and Jacobinical socialism had a power which we felt sure could dynamite all foulness of the earth. We lifted our eyes unto the hills with such dedication, the hills got jumpy. The Welsh language stood in the way of our fuller union, and we made ruthless haste to destroy it. We nearly did. Whereas we and our fathers stood squarely on the proposition that we should raise to full stature all the human refuse on this earth at whatever expense in hernias, the national brain now bulges with such projects as the need to deny Welsh rainwater to Liverpool Waterboard and the demand that the present limited education we now give to our children in English should be replaced by an even more limited education in Welsh. The revival of the Welsh language has witnessed the most drastic contraction of dreams in the history of weariness. Despite its appealing humour, and Gwyn Thomas is a great novelist who I recommend, his vision is pretty frightening from the perspective of a Welsh speaker like myself. One might expect a response to Gwyn Thomas's kind of view from the Welsh language community, and this took many forms, but some of the response's key characteristics can be gleaned from Minister T.J. Davies's Welsh language biography of Paul Robeson. His reconstruction of Robeson at the Ebbw Vale Eisteddfod is strikingly different to that of Dai Smith. Davies draws on Robeson's 1935 comment that Negroes the world over have an inferiority complex because they imitate whatever culture they are in contact with instead of harking back to their own tradition, to argue that the African-American singer touched gweithien ddofn ynom, ninnau fel y negroed wedi cefnu I fesur ar ein diwylliant brodorol a mabwysiadu yn Saesneg, eto yn Merin Hesgyr yn gwybod bod yn ddorin a gwerth, a phan ddeiau Paul Robeson yn misg yn lladmerydd hiawdl I ddiwylliant dyrmygedig, caim yn ddoin ar oddau lais I gri a foddwyd yn ein hys ymwybyddiaeth. A deep vein within us. Robeson touched a deep vein within us. This is my translation. Like the Negroes, we've turned our backs to a degree on our indigenous culture and adopted an English culture, yet in the marrow of our bones we are aware of its worth and value. And when Paul Robeson came to us, an eloquent spokesman for a derided culture, we found a voice for a cry that had been submerged in our subconsciousness. There is certainly an element of sadness in the scene. The thousands in the Eisteddfod Pavilion in Ebbw Vale applauding and enjoying the singing of a man who presented his own culture without apology. Yet those same thousands, despite seeing what Paul Robeson was doing and welcoming his message, were unable to take the political step that would give their nation the status that they believed should be granted to the Negro. It's a very different interpretation, right? It's informed by a familiar form of cultural nationalism based on the belief that language is essential, is the essential underpinning of culture, and in a sense is wholly dismissive of the English-speaking communities and cultures of South Wales. You know, if Gwyn Thomas was to read that, well, he's partly writing against that structure of thought, really. But Davies is drawing an attention to an overlooked aspect of Robeson's connection with Wales. Robeson himself, and Susan mentioned this yesterday, viewed language as the foundation for distinctive cultures, and in 1951 recalled learning languages in order to sing the folk songs, I quote, of the African, the Welsh, the Scotch Hebridean, the Russian, Spanish, Chinese, the Yiddish, Hebrew, and others. I'm picking up on a strain in Susan's opening lecture. While Robeson, during the filming of Proud Valley, expressed a desire to please the people of Wales by singing to them properly in their language, it is wonderfully rich and well suits my voice. There's no evidence that he actually did learn Welsh, although some people claim so. When he performs the national anthem, Hen Wlad Fy Nhadau, Land of My Fathers, at the conclusion of Proud Valley, he does so in English, likewise on the Transatlantic Exchange broadcast. Dafydd y Garreg Wen, the Welsh folk song, is listed as David of the White Rock in his programmes and presumably sung in English. And the final line, Ar hyd y nos, is the only Welsh heard in his performances of the Welsh tune, All Through the Night. That's not a criticism, incidentally. It's just a correction, maybe, to the idea that Robeson spoke Welsh. The Welsh language, he said, at the Ebbw Vale Eisteddfod, some further scenes from the event, is a language not to be trifled with, and unless I could be perfect at it, I would not attempt to sing in Welsh. Robeson was certainly interested in the Welsh language. Charles Blackson, writing of Robeson as a bibliophile, draws attention to a Welsh language grammar in his collection, and when asked to suggest an appropriate gift to mark his visit in 1958, he requested a Welsh language hymn book, presented to him by Wales's leading modernist Welsh language poet, T.H. Parry Williams. He's in the picture there, a major figure in 20th century Welsh language literature. J. Beverley Smith who died recently. Beverly Smith's father, Cecil Smith, was chairman of the Ebwy Vale Eisteddfod of 1958. I interviewed him on Robeson staying with the family, and he recalled that when Robeson stayed overnight, he was particularly interested in the collection of Welsh language literature at the house and asked detailed questions regarding Welsh folk singing and the ways in which Welsh language culture was supported financially. You may not know it, Robeson told the Eisteddfod audience, but I was brought up in traditions very similar to yours. My father was a Wesleyan minister, my brother is one, and almost every Sunday I've taken part in similar hymn singing to those that you're enjoying tonight. The Eisteddfod traditionally ends with a Cymanfagani, a hymn singing festival. There was a Welsh-only rule that was introduced in 1950, so they moved the Cymanfagani to the beginning of the Eisteddfod, so that the Welsh language rule did not apply, so that Paul Robeson could sing and actually joined with the audience as well then in singing the Welsh hymns. So, people still remember that event. It's worth perhaps noting then, just as an aside, as a consequence of thinking in these terms, and Susan makes this point in her book on The Left is Not Woke, that linguistic particularity really has nothing to do with tribalism or ancestor worship, or it doesn't need to, right? Language rights is, I think, one of the blind spots of debates around universalism and multiculturalism in the Anglophone world. If you can't change your ancestors, you can learn a language. So there's a pliability to the language community. It has its own internal diversity of voices. All kinds of people of different backgrounds speak Welsh. An indicative example today is that the chairman of Cymdeithas yr Iaith, the Welsh language movement, the most radical wing, really, of the Welsh movement, is led by Joseph Nagbo. Joseph is an asylum seeker from the Ivory Coast. So the question that arises from what I've said already are those that will be familiar of those reading the literature on the universal and the particular. Can there be an universalism that doesn't create an exception? Can there be a particularism that doesn't collapse into atavism and xenophobia and tribalism? How far can we go legitimately in the preservation of pluralism and cultural difference before we enter the terrain of xenophobia and apartheid? Does universalism ultimately entail the eradication of cultural difference? And in engaging with these questions, the Welsh tradition has a lot of resources, as does the African-American tradition, of course. In contemporary African-American studies, and this is my take on it, my question yesterday partly came from this, the figure when we talk about universalism is not Paul Robeson generally. It's Ralph Ellison. And Ralph Ellison, I was thinking about this yesterday, maybe is part of the reason why we don't talk about Paul Robeson. I wonder whether Robeson is a kind of Moses. We were listening to Go Down Moses. You'll be familiar maybe with Freud's Der Mann Moses und die monotheistische Religion, which is mistranslated as Moses and monotheism. But the idea is, like, the Jewish identity is based on the repressed murder of Moses in Exodus. That's what the story hides. I wonder whether contemporary African-American studies is in a way built on the murder of Robeson. Just a thought that came to me during the conference. When Ellison is discussed, and I want to discuss Ellison a bit, he is seen as a universalist and often derided in a way for that by some, especially in the black arts period, right? Addison Gale described Ellison as having bought into the propaganda of the academic critics, accepting the image of the faceless universal man, trapped in the narrow world of his own ego, along with the modern idea of a raceless world. For Gale, that's not positive. And even a sympathetic critic like Henry Louis Gates describes Ellison as a militant integrationist. Ellison is famous for offering a searing critique of the Communist Party in Invisible Man, in the shape of the Brotherhood, and was hugely critical of Robeson's views on African Americans and on Africa which he viewed as, I quote, neo-Garveyism from a wealthy singer. Albert Murray and Ellison ridicule Robeson fairly consistently across their letters, actually. But there's more to be said about the relationship between Robeson and Ellison than the dismissive quotations suggest. I spent some time in the Library of Congress with the Ellison papers, and there are 2 fat files of all his cuttings about Robeson. You know, he's genuinely interested in Robeson. Ellison described Invisible Man as having erupted out of what had been conceived as a war novel. And in his introduction to the 30th anniversary edition, he recalled the gestation of his most famous work as follows. What has this got to do with Wales, I hear you ask? I'd published yet another story in which a young Afro-American seaman ashore in Swansea, South Wales, was forced to grapple with the troublesome American aspects of his identity after white Americans had blacked his eye during a wartime blackout on the Swansea street called Strait. No, his name was not Saul, nor did he become Paul. References to Universalism there, I suspect. But here the pressure towards self-scrutiny came from a group of Welshmen who rescued him and surprised him by greeting him as a black Yank and inviting him to a private club, and then sang the American national anthem in his honor. The story was published in 1944, but now in 1945 on a Vermont farm, the theme of a young Negro's quest for identity was reasserting itself in a far more bewildering form. As I document in my book, Ellison docked in Swansea as a merchant marine on the SS Sun Yat-sen in January 1943, and the pressure towards self-scrutiny that led to the writing of Invisible Man seems to have been stimulated partly through his encounter with Wales. The narrator of Ellison's In a Strange Country comes ashore from the ship and feels the excited expectancy of entering a strange land. The encounter with Welsh national identity leads Parker, the central protagonist and narrator, to wish that we only had some of what they have. They're such a small nation than ours would be. Yet I can remember no song of ours that's of love of soil or of country, nor any song of battle other than those of biblical times. Parker, the central character, initially includes the Welsh in his blind rage after the attack upon him by white American soldiers. But then he acknowledges they're a different breed. They're even different to the English. The story anticipates Invisible Man in that it's saturated with references to sight and blindness. The black eye is fairly obvious, right? Upon entering a club with his Welsh hosts, the light strikes Parker's injured eye as though it was being peeled by an invisible hand. And the story is an exploration of the layers of identity that reaches a pinnacle in a final kind of anthem fest, which I'll read out. It's worth reading this at length because it's what the rest of the paper is kind of based on. When the opening bars were struck, he saw the others pushing back their chairs and standing, and he stood understanding, even as Mr. Catty whispered, "Our national anthem." There was something in the music and in the way they held their heads that was strangely moving. So he's in a male voice choir practice session, which is taking place above the bar where they've taken him. He hummed beneath his breath. When it was over, he would ask for the words. But even while he heard the final triumphal chord still sounding, the piano struck up God Save the King. It was not nearly so stirring. Then, swiftly modulating, they swept into the Internationale to words about an international army. He was carried back to when he was a small boy marching in the streets behind the bands that came to his southern town. Mr. Catty had nudged him. The ellipses are in the original. He looked up, seeing the conductor looking straight at him, smiling. They were all looking at him. Why? Was it his eye? Were they playing a joke? And suddenly he recognized the melody and felt that his knees would give way. It was as though he'd been pushed into the horrible, foreboding country of dreams, and they were enticing him into some unwilled and degrading act from which only his failure to remember the words would save him. Only now the melody seemed charged with some vast new meaning, which that part of him that wanted to sing could not fit with the old familiar words. And beyond the music, he kept hearing the soldiers' voices, yelling as they had when the light struck his eye. He saw the singers still staring, and as though to betray him, he heard his own voice singing out like a suddenly amplified radio, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. It was like the voice of another over whom he had no control. His eye throbbed. A wave of guilt shook him, followed by a burst of relief. For the first time in your whole life, he thought with dreamlike wonder. The words are not ironic. He stood in confusion as the song ended, staring into the men's Welsh faces, not knowing whether to curse them or to return their good-natured smiles. So Ellison is exploring the range of identities being embraced simultaneously by a national minority within the British state. From Welsh distinctiveness, the Welsh national anthem, to Britishness, God Save the King, to socialist internationalism, the Internationale. And this plurality seems to create a space where Parker can ultimately, with a star-spangled banner as a background, identify himself, it seems, for the first time as an American. Yet this affirmative reading is not wholly convincing, because there's a sense of guilt, degradation, and ambivalence in this as well. If the gesture of the look, repeated throughout the story, is inseparable from the documentary strategy of Ellison's realist story, this passage revolves around forms of blindness, thus offering an ironic gloss on the opening words of the US anthem, "Oh, say, can you see?" In failing to recognize that their black guest may not wish to identify with a star-spangled banner, the Welsh are in a sense blind to American racism, yet in that blindness they give voice to the unfulfilled universalist promise of American democracy. There's a lot that could be said about the story. What I want to emphasize is that the connecting anthem, the anthem that lies between Wales, Britain, and America, is the Internationale, which takes Parker back to the bands that came to his southern town. The anthem of international communism connects the anthems of Wales and Britain with the anthem of the United States. Barbara Foley suggests that in A Strange Country, the story is embedded in the discourse of the Communist Party of the United States, which had adopted, as we heard yesterday, a policy of a black belt nation thesis along the lines of the Soviet Union's support for folk languages and cultures. Similarly, the British Communist Party recognized the right for Welsh self-determination in 1939. The use of the Internationale as a means of connecting the Welsh and British anthems with the American anthem reinforces a connection made earlier in the story between Wales and Russia. And as the men sang in hushed tones, this is from the story, Parker felt a growing poverty of spirit. He should have known more about the Welsh of their history and art. In his mind's eye, he saw a Russian peasant kneeling to kiss the earth and rising, wet-eyed, to enter into battle with cries of fierce exultation. So where does this structure of feeling, to use Raymond Williams's phrase, come from? Among the Ellison papers at the Library of Congress, there's a lovely letter from a Welsh American living in LA. She admits to subscribing to the Negro Digest, in which A Strange Country appeared, and to occasionally attending a nearby African-American chapel, which I quote, "reminds me so much of my own people." She then congratulates Ellison on the story and then reminds him of the film Proud Valley, suggesting that the story is based on the film. In the final scene, in fact, the final scene of Strange Country, which I just read, could have been lifted from Proud Valley, the film of 1940 in which Robeson played David Goliath, as I said earlier, and settles in a Welsh mining valley. Robeson's performances from the mid-30s onwards offered a creative expression for the fusion of ethnic particularism and socialist universalism that I think the Ellison story is also reflecting. And this informed his responses to other peoples and places. We've heard this already. His increasing engagement with Marxist thought in the 30s led not to the rejection of a racial identity in favor of an universalist class identity, but rather a redefinition of class identity made possible by the black nationalist interpretation of Lenin and Stalin's definition of colonial peoples. From the early 30s onwards, Robeson expanded his repertoire beyond the spirituals to embrace the folk songs of other peoples, as we've heard. And he argued that he could interpret folk songs from around the world because of the fact, I come from a working class people. There's a kind of fusion of folk and class, and it results in a class identity which is not the product of historical forces, of social position or of economic position within a hierarchy. It seems to come more from common cultural practices, rooted ultimately, it seems for Robeson, still in an idea of race. His thinking seems to remain racialist. We tend to think of him abandoning his sort of Harlem Renaissance period racialism for internationalism, but I think the truth is the racialism persists. These are indicative quotes. To see how a Negro can really feel the sentiments of an Italian or a German or a Frenchman, for instance, Robeson argued that he failed to see how a Negro could. I believe that one should confine oneself to the art for which one is qualified. Rather wokish comment. One can only be qualified by understanding, and this is born in one, not bred. Nature, born in one, it seems, is more significant than nurture, bred in the making of a cultural sensibility, a view that Robeson reiterated again in 1934. These are all mid-30s quotes. I would rather sing Russian folk songs than German grand opera, not because it is necessarily better music, but because it is more instinctive and less reasoned music. It is in my blood. So, the continuity of a kind of romantic racialism with its roots in the Victorian era is still there. The key constituents of character and culture seem to be predetermined in my blood. What occurs in the 30s, it seems to me, that Robeson's racial conception of identity is generalized to encompass other oppressed people. The fusion of race and class allows the son of a slave who has become solidly bourgeois through the success of his concert performances, as Ellison liked to emphasize, leads him to identify with working people due to his membership of what he calls an oppressed race. That is, even if you're middle class yourself, you can claim to be working class because you come from a working class people, a trick that the Welsh Labour Party politicians play all the time. Robeson suggested that the particular fusion of class and ethnic identity, as I'm describing it, this is open to debate, of course, derived from his experiences in Wales. And he says this explicitly himself. And I went down into the mines with the workers, and they explained to me that, Paul, you may be successful here in England, but your people suffer like ours. We are poor people, and you belong to us. You don't belong to the bigwigs here in this country. And so today I feel as much at home in the Welsh valleys as I would in my own Negro section in any city of the United States. I just did a broadcast by transatlantic cable to the Welsh Valley a few weeks ago, and here was the first understanding that the struggle of the Negro people, or of any people, cannot be by itself, that is, the human struggle. So I was attracted by and met many members of the Labour Party, and my politics embraced also the common struggle of all oppressed people, including especially the working masses, specifically the labouring people of all the world. That defines my philosophy. It's a joining one. We are a working people, a labouring people, the Negro people. The passage is striking because of the apparent tension, perhaps, between the declaration of ethnic particularity, the Welsh, the Negro people, and an internationalist, universalist commitment to the human struggle. Robeson, however, would not see this as a tension. Deeply inspired by early Bolshevik policy and by Stalin's The National and Colonial Question, his vision, I think, derives from those sources. In spite of later attempts to curb internal minority nationalist impulses in the Soviet Union, the earlier policies inspired by Lenin and Stalin laid the groundwork for a flourishing of national culture that was not stopped by the later repeal of cultural support. It was, according to Kate Baldwin, the transnational formation of a Leninist tradition that Robeson strove to foster in his performances of national folk songs. And this is reflected in Ellison's In a Strange Country. Ellison had been a communist. He rejects it by the time he gets to Invisible Man. But in 1943, in a Strange Country, the Welsh folk songs remind Parker of Russia, and the Internationale functions as a link between the Welsh and American anthems. In a Strange Country is embedded in that same, to use a Wittgensteinian term Susan draws on Wittgenstein occasionally in her book, the form of life of a revived popular front, an internationalism characteristic of the late 30s and 40s. I see I probably started slightly later. Moving on to the last part of the lecture. I will return briefly to Ellison because I think he helps us make sense of Robeson. Some of you might be familiar with the debate between Ellison and the critic Irving Howe. In his essay, Black Boys and Native Sons, Howe, a leading critic, author of several volumes on American and European literature, and founder of the New Left's journal Dissent. I mean, Howe had been a communist, like a lot of his generation in the 30s, and has become more liberal and more conservative as his life proceeded. But Howe used the exposure of racism and social ills that characterized the work of Richard Wright, which he celebrated, to chastise Ralph Ellison and James Baldwin for their alleged refusal to embrace protest. For Howe, protest was an inevitable consequence of a Negro writer's lived reality in America. Ellison, for Howe, was in his feet and wasn't doing what African-American writers should do. Ellison responded in a couple of articles that he published under the title The World and the Jug. These pieces manifest Ellison's universalism for many. Ellison emphasized that, I quote, and I think I have this, not quite, but that's Ellison and Howe. The basic unity of human experience is Ellison's emphasis. It assures us of some possibility of empathetic and symbolic identification with those of other backgrounds. He draws attention to the performance of the slaves in recreating themselves, in good part, I quote, out of images and myths of Old Testament Jews. Richard Wright, says Ellison, is no father of mine, for culture does not conform to geographical or racial divisions. In Mason County, Alabama, notes Ellison, I read Marx, I read Freud, I read T.S. Eliot, Pound, Gertrude Stein, and Hemingway. Books which seldom, if ever, mentioned Negroes were to release me from whatever segregated idea I might have had of my human possibilities. Ellison questions Howe's tendency to read Invisible Man in relation to works by other black writers. Indeed, in the years of the civil rights movement, he sees Irving Howe perpetuating in the realm of culture the segregation that is being challenged in society. Howe's attempt at identifying that which is distinctive about African America is similar to the claims in a way made for black distinctiveness by nationalists at the time and later formulators of an African American literary canon. So from this perspective, from a nationalist perspective, Howe's critique and Ellison's defense of it functions as a reflection of Ellison's assimilationism. And Ellison's position is often seen as that of an assimilationist. But I think that's to ignore the fact that Ellison is not doing away with a jug in The World and the Jug. Deploying his titular metaphor, Ellison argues that Howe, and this is on the slide, seems to see segregation as a steel jug, with the Negroes waiting for some black messiah to come along and blow the cork. But if we are in a jug, it's transparent, not opaque, and one is allowed not only to see outside, but to read what is going on out there, to make identifications as to values and human quality. The jug, the container of cultural particularity, remains and can itself sustain its own internal diversity. Ralph Ellison wondered with some exasperation, I quote, why is it that so many of those who would tell us the meaning of Negro life never bother to learn how varied it really is? While sustaining his own inner diversity, the jug is also transparent. Inhabitants within the jug can see and respond to what's happening outside its walls, with the result that new types of language, new language games come into existence. Culture can transform through influence. Ellison's jug is perhaps a form of life, a frame for pluralism and a basis for a respecting of other particularities within the broader context of the human family. My last point, in the case of Ellison, it's his commitment to the jug, to the bounded particularity of the African American form of life, that's often ignored, with even sympathetic critics, let alone his nationalist detractors, viewing him a militant integrationist. Commentators and critics seem unwilling to allow for a position that argues for the integrity of particularistic language games and for the possible impact and influence of one form of life on another. The case for a particularism that coexists with a cosmopolitan universalism fails, it seems, to convince. But for Wales, quite as much as African America. I think it's the best model that we have. And I think it's a model that Ellison, as the historian in A Strange Country suggests, gets from Paul Robeson. If I wanted to push the argument a step further, perhaps their universalist particularism, or particularist universalism, I'm not quite sure which way around to express it, that it grew out of, at least partly, their engagement with the strange country from which I'm from. Michael Denning has suggested that Cold War liberalism is, I quote, the popular front without communists. While Ellison deleted, murdered, if you like, the communist and socialist content of his thought by the 1950s, the structure of his thought in terms of pluralism remained. Its form with regard to the relationship between universalism and particularism seems to me to remain intact. The role of the writer, he says at West Point in 1969, is to structure fiction which will allow a universal identification, while at the same time not violating the specificity of the particular experience and the particular character. Replace writer with artist, and I don't think anyone embodied that vision with greater force and influence in the 20th century than Paul Robeson. Diolch yn fawr.
The floor is open for questions. Susan.
So, Daniel, I am grateful for that very thoughtful critique of some of my work. Mostly people either love it or they, write hatchet jobs. So, I will say a little more in my own talk later today, but I just want to make a couple of general points. First of all, I'm a socialist, but I'm not a Marxist. And the reason I'm not a Marxist, among other things, is that I don't like class reductionism any more than I like any other kind of reductionism, whether it's racialist or gender or anything. I do not think that human being is ever adequately captured by those kinds of abstractions, okay? Second thing I want to say is that I think universalism is entirely compatible with cultural pluralism. And I did say that, perhaps.
That wasn't meant as a critique of, I was picking up some of the strengths
Yeah.
I realized as I was expressing it that it sounded as if it was critiquing maybe. And I realize you say that, and you emphasize language too.
I do emphasize language. You've been beginning to remind me of a conversation I had with a friend this summer in Galway, who's a professor of German, but is raising his family in Irish very strictly. Now he just we were talking about Daniel O'Connell, and as I was going on about how much I admire O'Connell, his face sort of darkens. And I said, I've never read anything bad about Daniel O'Connell. What is it? And he said we should all learn English. Now, there is an answer. And the answer is Paul Robeson. Very few of us are ever going to have his gifts of any kind, certainly not his linguistic gifts. But children who are raised bilingually have a very easy time learning lots of languages. I wasn't, but my kids were. And I think genuine universalism really does demand Robeson, I read his saying he could sing in 25 and argue in 9. Not that many, but at least the experience. 2 final points. When I want to emphasize against the contemporary trends all over the world, when I want to emphasize what's important about universalism, I am trying to remind people of things that we just take for granted now. That before about the 18th century. Foucault did say the concept man was invented in the 18th century. Now, he thought it was going to disappear. It was invented in the 18th century. And it's an achievement. It was an achievement to look behind or beyond all the different languages and the different forms and the different faces to say, there is something that we'll call human dignity that should be respected. Now, of course, we know that those claims can be formulated in constitutions and declarations of human rights and be violated all the time. We know that. But the ideal is something that I keep wanting to remind people to cherish, because this is my last point. If we want to look at what happens to a nation despised and oppressed for millennia, that revives a dead language that hasn't been spoken in 2,000 years, and becomes increasingly and furiously nationalist, I'm afraid all we have to look is at the latest news coming from Israel. Okay.
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
Yeah. I could see that where you were taking that. Yeah.
I'm not saying it's a necessary conclusion, but...
No. That would be my response to that in a way. But I don't disagree with anything you've said. Where I'm coming from is a political tradition that's been about resisting assimilation linguistically. It's been about resisting assimilation linguistically, right? So the struggle to establish Welsh language secondary schools, for instance. I mean, Gwyn Thomas said replacing a reduced English language with an even more reduced Welsh language. Well, that's not the reality, right? No one in Wales is a monolingual Welsh speaker. Some people lament this fact. It's easier to make the case for bilingual documents if you have monolinguals. So Wales, all Welsh speakers speak English. You go through school speaking both. But the struggle to establish those schools was always against the left, not the right. We were always struggling against leftist universalism that was assimilationist in intent. So what I sometimes hear in that kind of argument is the position that I've always argued against, while retaining the universalist, and I can see the broader question in relation to woke. And I see that tension. Maybe I'm reading it into it. We're looking at things through our own spectacles, but I see that tension in African American literature quite often as well. Duke Ellington introducing black, brown, and beige is interesting, because the black, brown, and beige is in there for the red, white, and blue, he says. Well, that suggests that there's a black flag, right? And they're in there. At the same time, he argues that actually we're not quite white, suggesting that black, brown, and beige is actually the history of African American assimilation. And he seems to play with both. So that it allows for a kind of creativity, actually, the process and the resistance to it. Of course, you can assimilate linguistically a lot easier than you can if you have a visible marker of your difference, which is a disadvantage if you want to retain difference, actually. But of course, in terms of relative suffering, it allows you to become white. In Noel Ignatius, how the Irish became white. So
there are two questions. Can we keep them short because we have about 8 minutes left? Mario.
So then I leave something aside and. Just a remark which opens the way to the next speaker, to Victor. Ralph Ellison, C.L.R. James, and this place, Potsdam. At the University of Potsdam, there was a center for Anglo-American cultural studies. One dissertation was a path-breaking dissertation was about Raymond Williams. Another one was about Ralph Ellison, and Ellison's break with communism, was portrayed in a very, let's say, in a very sober and understandable way, and the other which relates to your interest is C.L.R. James. The Black Jacobins were published in East Germany in 1984. but, on the initiative of Professor Walter Markov. Markov, a historian of comparative revolution, had also a strong interest in, let's say, in broaden the Marxist view to a cultural way, and he showed, particularly to me, that one can be easily Marxist and socialist in the same way. In 19, he was.
Can we?
I stop.
Because if it's a comment, you can make it after, but give him a chance to respond. Yeah, okay.
Yes, well, it's interesting to get that intellectual history. Yeah, and Raymond Williams is a huge central figure in the way I think. In Border Country, there's a rather similar scene to the Strange Country scene, where the choir sings the Welsh national anthem at the end of the Eisteddfod, and the central figure suddenly feels that he's out of control. The hairs grow on his hands. It's the Marxist suddenly facing a different kind of identity that he doesn't really want to deal with. And Raymond Williams's creative writing actually engages always with Wales in different ways.
Amber.
Hi, thank you for that talk. I really enjoyed it. I think there's probably nothing more important or more elusive than trying to articulate a locally grounded cosmopolitanism or a particularist grounded universalism. In the end, we're all speaking some language or another. Even if we learn English, that's still a particular perspective. So I think it's really important what you're trying to bring out there. What struck me, however, particularly in some of the quotes that you gave, was the elasticity of Robeson's use of my people, that it can be very capacious, and that is itself interesting. But what I noticed is that his people are always the working people all over the world, and that's over and against the others, not the bigwigs. And it struck me that there's actually is there a lack of universalism in that? It might touch on Susan's first point that she made about class. I just wonder if you had some ideas about that.
Well, yeah. I mean, Susan's point about class reductionism, right? I mean, that's potentially there. And, the history of actually existing socialism has a pretty mixed record in terms of how it's treated everyone else, right? So that's another example of the dialectic of enlightenment in the side of universalism. Robeson gets around it, in a sense, by describing all the people he identifies with as working people. But it's not an answer, it's an imposition of an unity and a denial of diversity. And I think that's a problem. That's a problem in his thought. In Wales, the same thing plays out. The Welsh like to identify themselves as a working class people. This has been proven in questionnaires. In England, the working class define themselves as middle class if you mark it economically on the scale. In Wales, people who are fairly solidly middle class still describe themselves as working class because their grandfathers were a miner, or So that question of self-perception is an interesting one for the communist and Marxist left. Being working class is kind of absolutely central. So, but it leaves things out. I think, that's what we are. That's what we are dealing with. It's the problem with universalism of the socialist kind, quite as much as the Christian kind.
So there are 2 minutes left, and I will then abuse my privilege if there's no. Do you have a question?
Go ahead.
Okay, well then I did want to come back to Raymond Williams and back to Mario's intervention, which is we seem to have a starting set of questions in how you define culture, or more clearly, how do you define the boundedness of culture? And that some of the remarks coming off the floor are also suggesting that if the culture is a working class one, then it's okay. Now I'm reminded of Mazzini's address to the working people of Italy, or some of the National Socialist pamphlets as well. So it's not necessarily exclusionary, and class or cultural reductionism doesn't resolve very well. I don't know if that's clear enough as a question.
Yes, it's clear enough, and yes, I agree. Yeah, where would we take that further? I mean, one of the appealing things about Raymond Williams to me, we're here to talk about Robeson, but you know, that broader leftist hinterland in Britain. I was saying earlier, if the conference was in the UK, yes, CLR James would be quite central to it. And CLR James and Stuart Hall are quite central now in histories of the New Left in the way they weren't. Yes. It's resulted in the occlusion to some extent of E.P. Thompson and Raymond Williams, who used to be the central figures. Yes. But in, say, Culture and Society, what Raymond Williams does is he respects conservative thinkers. Yes. You know, he gives them the space, he engages with them, and argues them out of their own position so that he ends up with himself, in a way, and the definition of culture as a working class culture at the end of it. But he's not dismissive, you know, and I think that there's a kind of model there in his actual engagement with peoples of different classes and different backgrounds. It seems to me that Robeson engaged cultural practice and cultural dialogue from the perspective of a kind of mutual respect, which derived from a humanism that was rooted in a respect for people's particularity. Even that line about the Welsh language, you know, it's not to trifle with. He can't sing it. He's not dismissing it. He's saying, you know, if I respect this culture that you have, and I'm happy to be here amongst you, and that, you know, that's the position he tended to take.
If we have a quick question, then Penny.
So just a question about your framing of Robeson maintaining a racialist kind of conception. And I'm thinking back to an old argument that Appia made that I'm not sure you would still hold to, Anthony Appia, about Du Bois being fundamentally grounded in biology. Yeah. And I just kind of push back because I think those formulations come out of a certain period, but that both people, Du Bois and Robeson, if you listen to them as historians, I think, and where Robeson would talk about the degradation of my people and enslavement comes out of capitalism and its necessary expansion into imperialism because of a profit motive, and that as they become deeply historical thinkers, there's a project that they share with a number of other people of historicizing racism. And they wouldn't have put it this way in the 20s or 30s, but pushing toward a deeply anti-essentialist view of the history of race. And of course, we're gonna get these different formulations, but, and that leads to a very, you know, and also reading the culture in terms of a very creative, you know, the very creative boundaries of interactions with multiple other cultures. So perhaps, yeah, and quick thoughts or to be continued over. Yeah,
that's a central debate, right? Appia's argument ultimately is picked up, isn't it, by Walter Ben Michaels more recently, that when we talk about culture, what we're really doing is talking about race, but we're pretending we're not. And that strikes me actually as a very American way of thinking of it, and language actually functions rather differently. That's why I like linguistic identity. It takes an effort to learn a language, but you can, and people of any background can engage with that. So Ben Michaels says, you know, Susan doesn't make this point in her book, but there are some parallels maybe in the Anglophone nature of the debate, that culture ends up being racial diversity, being segregationist and emphasizing difference. Well, as you're saying, I mean, Du Bois and Robeson use it very pliably. I guess it's race as practice rather than as thing. And the nice thing about language, of course, is that it's practice. It's something you do, and you can join a community, and you can occupy different communities at the same time. So I guess I'd argue for the reinsertion of linguistic diversity into that debate, and arguably that the rise of racialism as such a central category in the United States is partly a result of the eradication of languages.
So we'll thank Daniel there and change over.